Welcome to The Standard. I'm Andrew Dawson. On the program, we're going to be discussing the intersection of religion and culture in Ethiopia. Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's foreign press secretary will be here, and Hadani Ditmars will join us for commentary. But first up in focus, the controversial role marijuana has played in religions around the world. One of the most divisive topics in the country these days was a move by the federal government to decriminalize possession of small amounts of marijuana. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's legal. It simply means possessing a small amount of pot is more like getting a traffic ticket, and there's no criminal record. Many religious organizations have opposed the government's position, but according to my guest, Chris Bennett, they might have to rethink their position. Chris, thanks very much for being here.
Hey, well, it's a pleasure.
So, this is an intriguing topic to me, really, especially with so much being made in the U.S. and Canada about marijuana and about whether or not it should be legal, illegal, decriminalized, or criminalized. But to find out that there's a role marijuana played in organized religion is truly fascinating. So why don't you explain that to me? First of all, how is it that these two have managed to cross over the years?
Well, you know, it's inevitable that religions and the use of psychoactive plants would cross. In fact, in the case of cannabis, we know that humanity's history of it goes back at least 10,000 years. And for at least 6,000 years, people have been burning it and inhaling its fumes. The use of plants to induce a shamanic state is still taking place today in South America and Africa and places like that, where witch doctors or shaman will partake of a plant to try and find some divine information and then relate the experiences to that plant, to that being the detailer of that divine information. So that these types of substances would play a role in the formation of religion is only a logical assumption from an anthropological perspective. And in fact, we know from evidence that they do in fact play a role in these types of religions.
Now, I'm imagining, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine from a lot of organized religions, you're getting a little scorn and a little ridicule for your thoughts and your position on this.
Well, definitely there is websites out there, JesusJournal.com and stuff like that have been attacking my work and stuff. And that's to be expected because when you put cannabis into something like the Bible, for instance, it radically alters the meaning of it. And I want people to understand that I'm not the originator of this type of research. I wrote a book 10 years ago called Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana and Magic and Religion. And that book detailed the use of cannabis in a number of cultures, going back, you know, to the very earliest formations of culture in Assyria and Babylonia, where it was used as a magical and incense and anointing oil, in China, where we know like the oldest pharmacopoeia lists cannabis in China, and the Taoist priests would use cannabis for meditative purposes. In India, we have the example of the cult of Shiva still going today, a god whose worship originates back to the Stone Age. His devotees burn cannabis in chillums to this day. Even the Hindu religion itself is based on an earlier religion, the religion of the Aryans that came out from just outside of Iran. And those people were moved out of that area through conflict and spread off into different areas of the world and went over to India. And we know from archaeological evidence that's arrived out of the Karakum Desert, just outside of Iran there, it's in Russia, that they found a 4,000-year-old Soma temple. This temple was about the size of a football field, and half of that temple was dedicated to making the Soma drink. And this is a source of both the Vedic and Zoroastrian religions. And we know from the archaeological evidence that's been found, there are things like fossilized seed imprints and sediment in the pots, that this preparation was a cannabis preparation. So here, at the very formation of the even pre-Hindu religion, we find cannabis in a role. Most Western people, I think, would be more fascinated at the role that cannabis plays in the Bible. And when I was researching the role of cannabis in religion, I came across the work of an etymologist in 1936, a very well-known Polish anthropologist, Sula Bennett, who wrote about a Hebrew word, cannabisum. And this Hebrew word has been translated properly as fragrant cane and sometimes erroneously as calamus in the Bible. And this mistranslation took place around 300 BC when the Old Testament was translated into the Vulgate, the Greek books. So what happens, I'll give you the first example of this.
Okay.
God first appears to Moses in flames of fire from within a burning bush, right? And that burning bush commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil. And this holy anointing oil carries about 6 quarts of olive oil mixed mixed with about 9 pounds of this fragrant cane, cannabis, the word we're saying is cannabis, cinnamon, myrrh, and other spices. And every time Moses is to speak to the Lord on behalf of the Israelites, it's important to remember, too, that none of the other Israelites ever see or hear the Lord. They only go by Moses' relationship with the Lord. Moses goes inside what is called the tent of the meeting, and he covers himself in this oil. And it's important to remember that cannabis, the active ingredient THC, is fatty soluble. And your skin is, in fact, a big organ. So you mix it with oil, and you put it on your skin, and it goes...
absorb that right in.
Absorbs right in. And then he puts some of this oil on the incense altar, and he lights it, and a pillar of smoke forms up over the incense altar. And this pillar of smoke is referred to in the Hebrew as the Shekinah, and it represents the Lord's physical presence. And when the other Israelites look at the tent of the meeting, and the pillar of smoke is rising up out of the tent, they know that Moses is in there talking to the Lord. Right? And so what happens when we put cannabis in that scenario is Moses becomes like a shaman in South America or Africa. He goes in, and through the aid of a psychoactive plant, he burns it on the altar, places some on his skin, and then the pillar of smoke, he meditates on that, and he retrieves his answers from that. And so this kind of challenges in many respects the idea of a discarnate entity commanding Moses to go in and invade the land of Canaan and bring in all these rules and stuff like that, and radically changes the whole meaning of the Old Testament. And when we follow those references, when we were talking earlier, you're saying, well, how did it become prohibited?
Exactly.
When we follow those same references throughout the Bible, there's 6 distinct references to cannabis, we see that its use became associated with pagan practice, which means oracles and prophets who are commanding, like saying this is what the Lord has said, kind of fell out of favor as Israel moved away from a tribal religion, much like it was at the time of Moses, to a religion of kings and kingdoms. And it became more focused on rules and politics rather than shamanic revelation.
So you have this body of evidence, I mean, evidence is a good word for it. So you have this evidence and this theory and the evidence to back it up. Why is it then, is it not gaining more acceptance within some of these organized religions? I mean, specifically when you're talking about it here with the Bible, but within some of the other organized religions, why is it not gaining that acceptance?
Well, the reality is most of these people are unaware of it. When they first hear it, they kind of initially reject it. Myself and my co-author of Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, the book that deals extensively with this particular topic, Neil McQueen. Neil's in the university, one of the universities in New Zealand right now, just finishing up his MA in a degree in religious studies about this information. And our path has been to try and take this into academic circles at first. And my book, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, has in fact been reviewed in the London, England Sunday Times by Professor Carl Ruck of Boston University, as well as a number of other professors have reviewed it. So our attitude has been to try and get that academic support and solidify the information as much as possible. And then once that has taken place, to try and approach a wider avenue of disseminating this information. And I believe that time is now. We've accomplished that goal. We've received some recognition in academic circles, and now it's time to take that into the world of a wider religion. And for Christians, this is a particularly powerful message because the Hebrew term used for the one who received the anointing oil was the Messiah. And in Greek, this translates as Christ. And the term Christ just simply means in English, the anointed one. And in fact, although baptism is the modern Christian ceremony, for the first few centuries of the Christian period, there were scores of different Christian groups who all consider themselves Christians. Most of these are now known to us under the collective name of the Gnostics. But this term Gnosticism actually reflects a number of different groups with varying beliefs. Versus what became the Catholic Church, the church that formed around the teachings of the Apostle Paul, who actually never met Jesus. And one of the main points of contention between these groups known as the Gnostics and the Catholic Church is water baptism versus anointing with oil, the same anointing oil. In fact, Gnostic texts specifically say there is only water in the baptism, but there's fire in the anointing oil. And through the anointing oil, we're initiated into unfading bliss. And they specifically apply the anointing oil for a number of medical applications that are identical with those that are coming to the forefront of medical marijuana in our own time. And even in the Synoptic Gospels, the oldest of the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Jesus does not baptize any of his disciples, but in the oldest of the Synoptic Gospels, he sends out the 12 apostles with anointing oil to heal the sick and cast out demons. And to cast out demons back in the ancient world could have meant something like curing somebody of epilepsy, which was often thought up until medieval times to be demonic possession.
So do you think that by being able to present this case and make this case in books and on the websites and everything like that, that perhaps maybe it will gain more acceptance, the use of marijuana, or are you just simply just trying to lay out the facts and let people make their own minds out about it?
Well, you know, I want to be specific. I'm not academically trained, although I've taken a very academic approach to my books. I spent 5 years each on working on both of those books, and I had conversations and letter writing exchanges with a number of very well-known academics in order to come to these conclusions and stuff like that. But I myself am a religious user of cannabis. In fact, I've been a reverend with the Church of the Universe for over 15 years. And my use in cannabis was, my religious use in cannabis took place after a religious experience I had 15 years ago. And from that experience, trying to explain that religious experience to myself, I started collecting data and looking at cannabis and other religions. So my view is that this information is going to win the day. At the end of the day, the more they focus on cannabis, inevitably we're going to start looking at the history of cannabis, and inevitably this information is going to come to light. And that's the way that it worked with industrial hemp, which I was very involved with, and medical marijuana, which I was very involved with. Both of these things were scoffed at when they initially came onto the scene, but through the recorded history and the documentation, they have shown themselves to be facts, and the facts remain about the religious history of cannabis.
And you talked about a religious experience of your own. Is that something briefly that you can share with us, or is that something deeply personal that you don't like to talk about?
No, I don't mind sharing it. It might take a minute or two, but there was, first
I'll
of all...
give you a minute.
Yeah. First of all, I used cannabis for a long time before I had this religious experience, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't based on cannabis alone. A number of threads came together to bring this about. One of these things was the Mount Cashel orphanage, the priests molesting the children. Yes, at that time, I was working as a night watchman, had a lot of time on my hand, and I thought, well, I'm going to read the Bible and see how the hell something like that could happen. I started reading it, didn't make a lot of sense to me. Around that same time, I was living out near Clayoquot Sound there. The whole Clayoquot Sound controversy, logging old growth forest, took place. And I found out about industrial hemp and how paper could replace hemp. So I started finding everything I could about hemp. And then coinciding with this, the initial Gulf War took place with Papa Bush there in 1990. And because Saddam Hussein had flown a Scud missile into Israel, he was being compared to Nebuchadnezzar, an Old Testament king of Babylon, and Babylon's actually an age in Iraq. So to the religious experience, we bring all these elements together. One night I'm working as a night watchman and smoking a joint and reading a newspaper, and I see this ad for a sermon given by Pat Robertson, the American evangelist. And the ad was Revelations 18, the fall of Babylon. And picture beneath them, you had tanks and jets, and I was like, wow, they're tying in the Gulf War with the invasion in Iraq. And I'd seen the Omen when I was a kid, so I thought, I'm going to read the book of Revelation. So I went to the Night Watchman, retrieved the old Bible I'd had stuck there from before, and I started reading it. And at the beginning of the story, the guy takes a scroll. It tastes sweet as honey in his mouth, and then it turns bitter in his stomach, and he begins to prophesize. And then I started going, wow, that sounds like almost like a drug experience or something like that. And then I started coming across references to incense and cloth. And then I got to the end of the Bible, Revelations 22. On either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And when I read that, I had a feeling like light poured into my body, and that cannabis was in fact that tree of life. And I totally had like an emotional breakdown of sorts. And I called my wife at the time and explained to her what happened. She said, "You're going crazy," you know. And so
as most people who are having those experiences, that's how they're treated, aren't they?
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
Right. So I doubted it myself, but then I would, researching cannabis and hemp, I would come across these references. And one day I picked up, to cannabis and religion, and one day I picked up Licit and Illicit Drugs by Consumer Reports. And right in there, in Licit and Illicit Drugs by Consumer Reports, a very well-known lobby group, there was references to the biblical references to cannabis. And then from that, I started following it and researching it and finding out this whole hidden tradition about cannabis in the Bible, a tradition that other researchers had been exploring for more than a century before I'd even come across it.
Now, briefly, if you can, if people want more information about this topic, how can they find out some information? I mean, your books obviously is one way.
They could go to my website, forbiddenfruitpublishing.com. They could come by my shop at 307 West Hastings, the Urban Shaman inside the BC Marijuana Party bookstore, and buy copies of my my book there and start out that way. Or they could just do a Google search on Jesus and cannabis and take a look at how much information comes up. Stories in the BBC, The Guardian, the London Sunday Times, Washington Post, numerous stories and a number of sites debating this subject.
All right, well, great. Chris, thank you very much for coming in and sharing your thoughts and your insights and your opinions with us. We really appreciate your time today.
You.